The House Homeland Security Committee held a hearing this morning on identifying the threat of radical Islam. It proceeded exactly as you'd expect. Liberal Congressman Keith Ellison claimed we shouldn't even be using the term radical Islam because it might associate, in some people's minds, innocent Muslims with the terrorists. The Department of Homeland Security witness George Selam himself said Homeland identifies the greatest threat to our nation as ISIL's ability to recruit and radicalize new terrorists within our own nation. But he had shockingly little information on exactly how the department was fighting against that. Oh, and of course, there were the usual hacks on our Second Amendment rights, because legal gun owners in America make it harder to fight terrorists, according to the left. No mention, though, of Jason Faulconer, the man who stopped the Minnesota mall terrorist with his legally permitted firearm. Check it out.
Last year, this committee tracked the most homegrown jihadist plots ever in a single year in the United States. And 2016 could be even worse. Americans are rightfully worried that our city streets are once again becoming the battleground. Fort Hood, Boston, Chattanooga, San Bernardino, Orlando. Some have said this kind of regular terrorism is the new normal. But I strongly reject that argument. Complacency is not an option.
Joining me now is Director of the Threat Information Office at the Center for Security Policy, Kyle Shideler. Kyle, thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Liz. Thanks for having me.
All right, Kyle, you guys at the Center for Security Policy, you've been working closely on this hearing. Tell me what you've been doing.
Well, we were watching this hearing as it developed, and we were really excited about it. This was kind of a companion hearing to the willful blindness hearing which Senator Cruz had on the Senate side. And Subcommittee Chairman Perry really did a masterful job working on DHS Representative George Selam, talking about the administration, their poor choice in decision-making when it comes to who they reach out to. You know, he openly talked about how Secretary Jay Johnson had done a keynote speech at the Islamic Society of North America. Now, a federal judge has said the government provided ample evidence that ISNA is tied to Hamas. And George Selam sat there at the panel in the witness chair and said, yes, we love ISNA. We go to ISNA all the time. Big fans of ISNA. So he really drove home, Chairman Perry did, the nature of the Obama administration's outreach program, the nature of CVE, that is Countering Violent Extremism, and that program, and why it's been such a failure and why it will continue to fail to secure this country.
Right, and I want to get in a second to our taxpayer dollars at work in outreach by the Department of Homeland Security to these organizations that have ties to radical Islam here. But first I want to ask you about this hearing in general and what difference, not to use Hillary Clinton's words here, but what difference it's going to make, because Representative McCall, we heard in the video, saying complacency is not an option, and letting us know the statistic that there were more jihadist plots that were stopped in America in 2015 than any year prior. And we already know that even ISIS-related operatives, there's been over 100 of them arrested in the United States just in the last 2 years alone. But I got to tell you, Kyle, it's kind of demoralizing after the bombings in New York and in New Jersey, the stabbings in the mall in Minnesota, all clearly tied to radical Islam. It would be, I'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who would deny that, except for President Obama and Hillary Clinton. Still no mention of those words from them.
Well, that's true. I think what we've seen is really almost the radicalization of the Democrats' position when it comes to dealing with counterterrorism. We saw today Democratic members of Congress who essentially were prepared to abandon countering violent extremism as a strategy which already doesn't work, and move on to something even more inept, which was essentially telling Americans to shut up when it comes to asking questions about who's behind Islamic extremism, and moving towards questions of gun control, as if attacks on the First and Second Amendment is the best way to deal with the Islamic State, and that's simply not true.
Right. And just the Obama administration talks about the rhetoric used by the right. They talk about the use of radical Islam, and President Obama has said he's not going to use it because what difference would it make in fighting this enemy? And here they use a term like extremism that actually means nothing when it's not attached to another word here. But Representative Keith Ellison, he says the words, he straight up said the words won't make ISIL vanish, saying the words radical Islam will not make ISIS vanish. And he talked about the association, these are his words, the association people might have between legitimate Islam and the terrorists, if we use that term, and that we need to protect legitimate Muslims from this association. Kyle, isn't it actually the opposite? Doesn't it work the other way, that when you don't distinguish between the two, it does a disservice to peaceful Muslims?
Well, that's not only my opinion, that's the opinion of the president of Egypt, al-Sisi, who went on television and said, yes, this is Islamic extremism. Calling it anything other than Islamic is simply silly. It gets us away from talking about what the threat really is, and as a result, we just need to be open and honest. He says, this is where the problem lies, this is the community that the problem lies in, and we have to address that. That's the president of Egypt. That's not me. Now, it's no surprise that Representative Keith Ellison has a problem with this kind of idea, since whereas al-Sisi is cracking down on Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood, Representative Keith Ellison gets along with them very well. So this is certainly the Islamist line coming out of the administration, that you can't talk about Islamic terrorism, you can't talk about Islamic ideology, because that will somehow offend the Islamists. But as part of my job, I read a lot of Islamic State propaganda, a lot of al-Qaeda propaganda, and I can tell you that the propaganda says nothing really about how we use words. What it does say is why they do the things they do on the basis of a doctrine that they understand, that they believe in, and which they take very seriously, and which they are willing to die for, and that is a ideology which is built upon Islamic doctrine and Islamic legal theory. So simply pretending that that's not the case doesn't do anything to Islamic State, it doesn't do anything to al-Qaeda, which will continue to perform jihad in the same manner that they have done so, regardless of what we say.
Right, it essentially just enables them, because it prevents us from being able to predict what they would do if we don't have an understanding of why they're doing what they're doing. And this administration chooses to be willfully ignorant of their motivations. Kyle, thank you so much for this update. It was great to talk to you as normal. I'll see you again soon. Our next Tipping Point with John Gabriel is the war in Syria. We'll be back for that in just a minute.